So again, we want to welcome you. This is Jennifer Witt, Director of ProjectManager.com. I have with me on the call Tom Killen, and we're both going to be working together in this session on how to scope your project. If this is your first time on the call, we want to welcome you. We're going to be taking this subject of how to scope your projects. I personally feel like that scope, again, is a 5-letter word. It's not a 4-letter word, but it's just as dangerous as some of the 4-letter words we know. So scope is one of the areas where it can literally change the status of your project from a successful project to a failed project. And the research shows that the scope can cause, the longer you wait in the project to begin discovering some scope issues that should have been covered or defined up front, the longer you wait in the project to uncover them or address them, the more costly they are to your project. So these are some of the things we're going to be addressing today. Again, I'm Jennifer Witt, Director of ProjectManager.com, and so we, again, want you to ask questions on the sidebar. So let's take some of the things. And here we just have a few graphics on scope. And the visual, the little cartoon picture up in the top left-hand corner where you see different visuals, it's a cartoon that's seen a lot of times, and it's just showing how differently different people see scope of a project. So this indicates different ways people see it, the way the customer explained it. It starts to the left, how on the scope a tree with the little swing, it's how the customer explained they wanted this deliverable, and the next one is how the project leader understood it, and then it just goes through how the analyst sees it, the programmer, and really at the end, the final picture is how the customer really needed the project. So it just goes to show you, here's a simple thing that gets so distorted through the project. So it's very critical, it's very important to define the scope up front and constantly monitor it, constantly control it throughout the project. So when we talk about scope, there are different types of scope. There's project scope and there's product scope, and there is a difference between the two. There's the question here of what's in scope and what's out of scope, and it's very important to define those in your project plan and in your charter or your statement of work, wherever you have your scope defined. So again, it's almost more important to define what's out of scope, because many times on our projects, the customer or even other members of the project think that some things are in scope when they're truly out of scope. So it's best to define both. And then again, the visual of changes all along the way. So let's take a look at what we're going to be talking about. And again, scope is an area that it's a subject that could be, we could talk about this for days, and I could give different scenarios, lessons learned, and I know you could as well. So we're going to talk about scope. We're going to talk about defining it. We're going to talk about managing it and implementing a change control process. We're going to include some best practices that we found and some tips that might help you along the way, and offer some next steps that might help you and guide you for your project. So if we look at scope, again, we're going to define it, monitor it, and implement change control along the way. So when we talk about defining scope, there's best to, whether you have been managing projects for years. I know I see some names of attendees on this call. I've worked with many of you personally for maybe 15, 20 years, so I know you've been managing projects for a long time. So whether you're managing projects for a long time, or if those of you who are new to the call and you found yourself managing a project, as we identify it as the accidental project manager, and you're trying to learn how to manage projects early on. So no matter what category you fall in, it's best to find a framework to go by. There are different ones available, and many times you'll hear me reference the one by PMI, the Project Management Institute. So the Project Management Institute, as well as, there are other frameworks. There's Agile, there are different ones available. Find your favorite. It depends on what area of the world that you're in that one is more dominant, It also depends upon industry. So pick the one that's for you. Again, I'm usually appealing to a global international audience, so again, I'm going to reference PMI, the Project Management Institute, when I'm talking about a framework. And if you can Google that and you can look for, they produce a guide to the project management body of knowledge. They call it the Pmbok guide, and currently the current edition is the 4th edition. So if you have access to a browser even now on the call, you can Google this, and this is what I'm going to be referencing. But there's a whole area on scope, and when we talk about scope, there is a process for it. There's also, they provide a framework, and then also it's important to find a methodology. So if you don't have a methodology, there's one called, Method 1, 2, 3 out there. You can find it. You can Google that as well. Many of you use a defined framework or process or methodology within your company. So always best to look there. But what I'm going to be referencing today again is PMI through the Pmbok guide. But when we talk about scope, we talk about defining it, and to me, one of the most important and valuable things that I found, and other people have found valuable too, is what we call the Deliverables Diagram. So when the phrase, a picture is worth 1,000 words, it truly is, and we believe that it also saves 1,000,000 meetings. So when you're defining the scope of the project, and here you see a hierarchical design here, and what you see in green is what we call a deliverables diagram. So when you're defining the scope of the project, it's very important when we talk about, we're setting a vision, we're setting a visual of what the project scope is about. So this is just a simple scope deliverables diagram. This one is just a high level of an office project, and the scope in the deliverables diagram. So within this, you'll see phase 3 is kind of sitting out there to itself. It's on hold. It hasn't truly been defined yet. So it's identified, but a placeholder held out there by itself. But if you look below the office project and you look at the deliverables diagram of the scope there, that you see project management deliverables. And when you look at the project management deliverables, that can be broken out to a lot of different things. And here we've identified 2 phases of this project. So phase 1 is talking about producing a foundation, the structure of the office, and it's providing the electrical and plumbing. Phase 2 is going to provide more of the design, furnishings, and equipment. So each one of these green boxes continues to be broken down in representing deliverables. So when we talk about a scope of a project, it's everything that's going to be produced as the result of this project. So this is just identifying the scope of this project. So why do we want to define the scope? Why is it so important? So if you see the diagram on the left-hand side where it indicates the deliverables diagram, the deliverables that are deliverables being the scope. So the scope is actually, when we produce the deliverables, we're producing the deliverables that are produced as the result of the charter of the project. So when we identified this by producing these up front and using the deliverables diagram up front to paint the picture of what's in scope, it's used for several things. It's used to provide information for time. So each one of the green boxes that produce a deliverable, we actually associate time. How long is it going to take to produce that? Excuse me. It also produces the information for the cost. That information is important because it feeds information that ultimately becomes the baseline of the project. So the time built out in total with all the dependencies required builds a timeline or the schedule, and the cost ultimately identifies the budget. So why would we want to So once we produce the scope of the project, it's important to monitor the scope. And when we monitor the scope, there are 4 big questions that we want to continue to ask. It's important to constantly look at what was the original scope of this project. So the scope being, when we talked about the baseline on the previous screen, we're talking about what's the baseline scope, what deliverables are supposed to be produced. That's what we've agreed to with the customer. That's what's in the project charter. That's what's in our statement of work. So that's what everyone, not only in principle, has agreed to, but we've actually legally agreed to that as well. So in most companies, most organizations, if there's an external agreement, there are legal agreements, and even internal. So many times people tend to think, oh, well, this is just an internal project. However, there's still agreements to that. There are budgets agreed to that. These projects that we're on, that we're managing, are part of corporations rolling out either maybe a new business line, maybe a new product. It's something critical to go to market. So even if it's internal, it's filling the goals for that company for that year. So we look at what was in the original scope and what's actually being produced from this project. So here's where we begin looking at the deliverables and what's being produced, and is it in scope. So this is where terms like gold plating, where things begin being produced and you're looking at things and you're like, where did this come from? And people are so excited that they're produced this as a deliverable, but it's not actually part of the agreed upon scope. So that's one of the gotchas where we end up having produced something that the customer has to pay for that no one agreed to, so it makes people unhappy. And it also is the opportunity where we begin getting off, our schedule gets off and our budget gets off. So we constantly monitoring what's actually being produced and constantly questioning, you know, was this even agreed to? Was it in scope or was it out of scope? Does it meet the specs? Because there are requirements documents for each of the deliverables being produced, so we have to ensure that it meets the specs. And if it doesn't meet the specs, we look at, how do I get it back on track? If we produce something, if our team has produced something by gold plating, again, we've probably injected more time on the timeline than we had, or we've exceeded a budget, if not both. And so we have to look at now where do we have to adjust to get back on track. If something's taking longer or doesn't meet the specs and we have to go back and redo or reproduce that deliverable, make some changes to get it back in line, then again, it impacts our project. It impacts the triple constraint. And so we have to constantly look at how do we get it back on track. So here we look at change control. What are the 7 components needed? So here's some important things that you as the project manager need to be referencing as you're managing the scope and all the changes that arise during the course of your project. So one is knowing that there is a triple constraint. So those of you who are new to project management, there are always questions, what is this triple constraint thing I hear about? And more importantly, why are there 4 components instead of 3? So the triple constraint helps identify the time, the cost, scope, and quality of the project. So we're always looking at how to keep our triple constraint balanced. Then we look at the scope document. Again, this is referencing the baseline scope. So the scope is identified in your project charter. It's identified in the project plan. Many companies also have an addition to, or it's part of the charter or the plan. It may be called a statement of work. Some people call it an estimate response document. Some people call it a business case. So it could be, the scope document could be called different things in your company, but that is the baseline scope. Remember, the baseline scope is what's been agreed to formally and legally between all parties. So you constantly have to look at the scope document. Then there needs to be established the change control board. Some people see it as your CCB. So if you hear people talking about a CCB, they mean the change control board. They're the people who are formally authorized on your project. These people have a name. So not only do the people on the change control board have names, but they represent different areas maybe of the business. Generally the customers are represented on your change control board. Different stakeholders, could be different business units, could be different partners of your company. It could be, if this is a construction project, different areas of construction. If it's a technology project, it could be some people from the technical team. And again, so these are the people who are authorized to evaluate and approve changes that are submitted to the change control board. Then also we need change request. So change requests come in, but we need like a template. There are different templates available. You can do a Google search on those for a change request template. Again, we tried to provide as many of these as we can out on projectmanager.com, so you can go to projectmanager.com, or you can go to Method 123 or any other sources and find templates. But you want a way to capture change requests that come from either your customer may submit change requests may come from different people working on the project where they see an opportunity of something that needs to be changed or added or even deleted. So that needs to be captured on what we call change request. Then change request logs, again, there are templates for the change request log and knowing what needs to be identified, but the change request log basically logs when, what is the change, when did it come in, who submitted it, when did it come in, when is it due to be evaluated, and who represented it, maybe who's evaluating it. And depending upon your company or your organization or your project, you may want to track additional things. But again, it's managing the change requests, more importantly to make sure we've captured the change request, we've acknowledged them, they've been submitted to the change control board or they haven't, but it indicates the status, and what was the ultimate decision on this change request. Then the change request process. So if you look at the last two, the change request process and change control process, they're different items. They could be in the same literal process document, but these are two things. One, the change request process actually provides a process to your team, so your team and the customer and everyone involved knows the process or the flow. So if someone has a change request, again, something for a scope or change, then they know the flow of this change request. Where is it going to go? Who do I submit this to? What person or what group, or how do I do it? And then what is the flow? Where does it go from there? And so that's the change request process. And then the change control process is actual identifying, where does the change go? How is it evaluated? Who evaluates it? Maybe there's an escalation period. So that identifies the change control, the decisions, the evaluation, the approval or denial of a change. So those are seven of the components needed for implementing change control. So there is what we call a three-step cure for controlling the scope. But before we get into this, I want to ask Tom. Tom, do we have any questions before we go into this section?
Yeah, we do. One of the questions was, what is the difference between product scope and project scope?
Okay, good catch, because that was on one of the first screens. So it is important to distinguish the difference between the product scope and project scope. So the product scope is talking about the features and the functionality or that characterize the product, the service, or result, whatever you're delivering from the project. So again, the features and functionality of the product, service, or result. But that's different than the project scope. So the project scope identifies all the work that needs to be done to accomplish delivering the product, service, or result of the project. So the project scope is more like the activities, the task that need to be done to begin producing the deliverables. So that's a great question. There are two different things, and they have to be identified. Again, both principles apply where it's good to identify what's in scope and what's out of scope for both of those. Okay, do we have another one?
I think we're good for right now.
Okay, so in here, when we talk about controlling scope, we call it a three-step cure for controlling scope, because a lot of times people have questions about scope where it gets off track and they have, not only problems within their team, but with their customer in submitting more additions to the scope. When you're actually started the project and you're on your way, people want to add things, and then you find your team doing things that you weren't aware of. So here's the cure that we found, and we call it the three-step cure. So first of all, defining the scope, which we just talked about. So when we define the scope, we not only define it, but we have to make sure everyone knows the scope. You, the project manager, have to know the scope. I can't tell you how many times I'm go into projects and start talking to the project managers, and they're not familiar with the scope of the project. So some projects that project managers are on are really huge. I mean, they could span multiple years. They're very vast. I've had the pleasure of working with different project managers on aeronautical projects and literally building missiles and rockets. And if you can imagine how big those project plans and how big those scope documents are. So for one person, that's a lot. But typically on those projects, you have multiple project managers managing different areas of the scope. So whatever the project manager has the span of control over, that's the scope I mean. And it's good for, like, if you're the overall program manager, portfolio manager, whatever you have the span of control over, you have to have the knowledge of. But if there's someone managing a specific scope of a certain subset of that project, that's what they have to know in detail. But you have to know the scope, and so does your team. You cannot communicate it enough by letting people know. It's painting a picture. There are three areas that I think are important of knowing the scope or defining the scope, and it's documenting. So you document the scope, and you have it so people can access it. If there are questions, you can reference it. So it needs to be documented, and it's good to, again, introduce that in your kickoff meetings. So in the kickoff meetings where we showed the hierarchical, the deliverables diagram, that's beautiful. It paints a picture. I'm a very visual person, so pictures help me. Pictures are worth 1,000 words, and they save me 1,000,000 meetings. So in addition to not only the hierarchical or the deliverables diagram, I literally start using pictures for myself. I start trying to paint a picture. I try to start showing people, like if someone is building a missile or a rocket, give people a visual of what does this look like. What does a rocket look like? I mean, keep it in the forefront of people's mind. If you're building a house or a building, if you're on construction projects, if you're on IT projects, healthcare, give people a visual to say, hey, this is what we're doing. This is what all of us collectively are working towards producing. And show that in the kickoff meeting. And then also one-on-ones the best you can. The key people and one-on-ones can be by phone, because some people are like, well, my key team members are across the world. I may be working with someone over in New Zealand. Well, so one-on-ones can be done now greatly through technology. I mean, we're doing this today through GoToWebinar. So one-on-ones can be by phone, by technology, or they could be if you're co-located. I'm a face-to-face person, so I love face-to-face. So just sitting down with someone and going over the scope. Again, remember, this 5-letter word is one of the things that can change your successful project to a failed project. So this can put you in a different statistic or group of people where you find yourself either being on the wall of success of project management, or the wall of shame. So the scope is one of the biggest things. You cannot say it, you cannot communicate it enough. Then it's training the team. Training the team. So there are also your core team members, but there's also the change control board, which includes stakeholders, customers, other vendor partners maybe, the key people, but training them on what is the scope and how to identify and communicate any changes, because we all know changes are going to occur, but people don't understand. It's like, okay, well, we've got this change, so they don't understand the process. So I think people on a whole, they don't do things intentionally to harm the project, but they don't know it all, so they do the best they can, and they start trying to accommodate. So it may be your team member trying to accommodate a customer request, and and when they do that, they maybe try to accommodate the request, thinking, okay, it may not cause that much damage if I do this, but it can cause all kinds of issues. So it's just because it's not clear to them, okay, if I get this request, what do I do with it? Where do I go? I don't want to just tell my customer that I can't do anything for them. So it's training the team on how to identify and communicate the changes and how to get them to the right places and using the right process. And then the third component of this is, or the third step is, communicate. And we want to communicate frequently. Any kind of scope changes, communicating frequently what the baseline scope is, communicating the changes, and doing that in different formats, different forums. So talking about the scope in your status meetings, in your board meetings, on your status reports. Again, keeping the visual of what we're doing and why, and then making sure everything is changed or modified along the way. So as changes occur, updating, going back and updating the changes on all the documents and all your project documents, and communicating to all the parties involved. So, Tom, I'm sure after that there are probably some more questions. Do you have any more on?
Yeah, there's a good one. It says, my customers are the world's worst at adding scope creep. How can I keep them from doing that? How do I get them to stop?
Oh, okay. That's very common. That's very common, and we should have contest on the world's worst. That would be a good one, because every project has at least that one, right? So what we found is you can't really ask your customers to stop asking, but you can train them on the process. I mean, it kind of talks, the things that we talked about, the 3 steps we just talked about is one thing, but first of all, remember, you can't stop them from asking, but you can train them on the process. So first of all, if you've been, whether you're the project manager again or your team member, so training your team members on how to handle this, because usually they're the ones that get bombarded too, because they think no one will know, so I'll just go to the team member who is working on these components and just ask them. So acknowledge their requests. So when a customer comes to you with different scope items or wanting, a few more things added into the project, then acknowledge their request, and let them know they've been heard. I mean, after all, they are the customer and they are paying for the project. So acknowledge their request and explain that they being the customer or the owner of this, they have a process and they require you to follow the process, and so you can direct them, or that you can direct them to their change control member. You can either take the request, but typically in working with client organizations, they like those requests to come through them, because if you think of a change control board, so you're the project manager, you are on the change control board, and then as well as the others. So remember the stakeholders, those are the people who are authorized to evaluate and approve the changes. And typically if different business units are represented, or vendor partners or different groups are represented, those representatives they request that the request from their business unit, their company, their organization to come to them first, because they know the overall scope of the project. They're in line with the executive committee on why this project's actually being done. So typically, again, they being the business unit owner, the person who's on your change control board, like those requests, but check in, like do what's right for your organization. A lot of times we use these guidelines, but we have to put into practice what is right for your project, your team, your organization, your company. So see what's right, but navigate them to the correct place and make sure that their request is addressed, because there is a process, and typically a customer has identified something that is valid. So it is valid. It may be valid scope that needs to be added. However, when submitted to the change control board, when it's submitted and it goes through the evaluation process, it could be approved to include in this release of the project, and then they do the due diligence to figure out what's going. Maybe this is included and something else is removed, or it could be valid and it could go into maybe the next phase or the next release. So typically what the customer is trying to invoke or add is valid. It just needs to go to the correct process. So again, we don't want to stop them. We don't want to prevent them. We want to prevent them from adding the scope creep the improper way. So I hope that answers your question. It's probably long-winded, but it's an important one. And remember, the 5-letter word is the derailer for projects. I wanted to spend a little time. And we've got probably time for one more before we move on to the next area, if you have another one.
Yep. There's one more that's come in. It says, I have a team member who's notorious for doing additional work for the customers behind my back. I only find out about it when the extra time shows up in the time sheet, blowing our estimates, budgets, and timelines. He says he feels forced to because the customer asks him directly, saying that it's critical. Nothing seems to work.
Okay, well, these are great questions. I'm glad that you guys are submitting these. These are really good, and this is, I find, very, very common. So if other people on here, if you just want in the questions box, kind of give an amen out here, these last two are definitely real life every day on almost every project that I've been on. So what the question that I heard is that the team member is feels like they're being forced because the customer comes along and says it's critical, and so the team member probably doesn't want to turn them away. So again, whoever asked the question, you summed it up very well, because the end result is that it does blow typically your estimates, budget, and timeline, and derails your project. So I think it's good to go back and explain to your team member the results, because although they think they're doing a great job and they think they're handling that customer correctly and taking care of them and being the hero for the project, again, it really backfires and it derails the project. So explain to your team member the results, number one. But there are two parties involved in this problem. There's not only your team member, but it's the customer. So I think this gets back into the training thing that we talked about. So it's, again, going back to train your team and this customer. So this end customer probably, it sounds like, may not be on the change control board, but they're in maybe a business unit who's aware of the project, and so they're asking this person to do additional things when they find out they're working on the project. So again, likewise, explaining to the customer the end result of what they're asking for. And generally what I found, again, I go back to the fact of typically your team members or your customers or people who are interjecting these issues, it's not that they're really wanting to cause damage to their own project. It's just that they don't know what the process is. So it goes back to training. So I think it's communicating to not only your team member but the customer that here is the agreed upon defined scope, and we do have a change control process. And again, for the customers, I always like to remind them that it's their process so they don't think it's Jennifer Witt. It's like, that Jennifer Witt and her change control process. Well, it's not really mine. It's their company. So I like to remind them that it's their process, and I, as a project manager, or the team, or even the change control board, have to comply with that change control process. So with that, communicate the scope and that there is a change control process. Again, train the team and give them the ammo, because the team members who get accosted by all these questions, it's uncomfortable for them. They don't like it, and they do the best they can. So, give them the ammo. Give them, some phrases to use. Give them some things like, you could coach your team members to say something like, hey, that's a great idea. Could you maybe email that to me, and I'll submit it to the change control board? Or something as simple as, I'm not sure, can I get back to you? Or, again, just a simple email request. And then that way, the team member can email the project manager, and then you as the project manager can take it from there and get it to the change control process. But I think it's just a constant training thing. And again, paint them a picture for what goes wrong. I've got a quick story here for this one. It's on a technology project. There was this exact same thing that happened, and what was happening was one of the end customer, this was a software development project, and so the end customer would come in and sit down with the developer and ask them to include different things while they were working on the project. So this specific developer, my team member, was trying to accommodate them. So this developer was putting these changes directly in production, not in a development environment, but they directly into production. So no one knew about these changes. So it happened to be when this software phase had ended, it had been tested. So the development environment, for those of you doing software projects, and those of you who are not, maybe I can help explain this so that you can understand, but in software, things are done in like a development environment, and once everything is ready to go, the clean changes that have been tested and it's ready to go is pushed out into a production environment. So it overwrote all of those changes that the developer had done, and no one knew about those changes, but they were actually fixes to things in production, and this was a financial services project. So it turned out that this system was down for 3 days as a result of this. So this major financial system of this company out 3 days, and this developer who had been putting this into production with no one's knowledge was actually out of town on vacation. True story. So it was very devastating. When he returned, he didn't get fired, but he got reprimanded pretty harshly. But it was a testimony. I as the project manager didn't have to really say much, because the customer was mortified. The customer who had been asking this developer to put these things into production got called out. It got highlighted. That person almost got fired. And then the team member. So it was caused such devastation to a live production environment of a company where the financial systems were critical, that I, as a project manager, didn't have to say a whole lot. I didn't have to jump up and scream about all of this. I mean, the scenario, the devastation spoke for itself. So if you paint a picture and let people know what devastation can occur, that's really good ammunition. Thanks for the questions. We've got a few more things to cover, so I'm going to move on. So when we talk about things, as you know, we've collected best practices along the way. So there are 6 of these that best practices to manage scope in a project. So when we talk about scope, we feel strongly that you have to assign specific people to the task and deliverables. So if you remember the deliverables diagram early on that we showed all of the scope, the deliverables being produced, when you're managing your project as a project manager, you're managing the scope, you want someone specific to be able to go to address for the task and deliverables being produced, because again, remember, you're constantly monitoring and asking, is the scope or the deliverables being produced, is that in the original scope? If it is, does it meet the specs? If it's not in the original scope, why in the world did we produce it anyway, and what effects is it going to have on our project? So you want specific people to go to ask those questions, not an organization. An organization, no one will. Selective amnesia quickly sits in when you start trying to find someone in a, quote, organization. They all of a sudden have no knowledge. Number 2 is provide online access to the project plan and schedule. So because when the scope is defined, the scope and deliverables being produced, we want all of our team members. We want the project manager, we want the change control board, we want people working on the project to be able to have insights and access to this information online. And we want to be, on number 3, updated real time. The more you can do that as a project manager, and I cannot say this enough, the tools are available now. You know, back in the day when I was like literally writing this stuff on paper, sticky notes, arranging this on my walls and wall calendars, that was very, very difficult. But now the systems, online applications, apps are available, and we as project managers have to adopt this technology. I talk to so many people out there, they're hesitant, they don't know how. Well, start asking questions. There are a lot of people out there. The project management community, there are people known. There are people in the projectmanager.com online community who are very involved in this. Start asking questions. I want to know how to do this. How do I do it? We've got resources at projectmanager.com. We've got, you know, videos showing this. So adopt it and embrace it. It makes it not only easier for you as the project managers, but your team members are screaming for this information. They want it easier for them too. And report anything off track immediately. As soon as you see that you're producing scope or deliverables that were not originally agreed to, or you see that your team member is gold plating stuff, or you've got customers asking, you know, you have to address these things immediately and get them back on track. You have just a split second. If you think of things derailing, I think of trains. I grew up near a train track, so I think of trains, I think of derailing. You've got a split second to address these, or your project is quickly derailed. Then you have to escalate any issues or risk quickly, because when you're talking about scope, again, remember, it's usually valid, and so you've got to look at, is this something we're going to incorporate now? If we don't incorporate it now, what issues or what risk might it bring? And trust me, there are sometimes where there are big decisions that have to be made around scope. There are issues and risk associated with if you do it or if you don't do it. So getting those addressed and escalated. And then important to not only your team, like you as a project manager, your team, your change control board, your customers, submitting changes promptly, making decisions quickly, and rebaselining accordingly. Rebaselining is one of the huge things for your scope. Is once your change control board does evaluate and approve something, or if they're including new scope or things change, that's your opportunity as the project manager to rebaseline your plans. If you as the project manager do not do that, then it's your own fault, because that is your opportunity to rebaseline the project. It's the approval from the change control board, which includes your stakeholders, customers, the people paying for this. They're saying they've made the decisions, they've agreed, and they've approved that things can change. So when you rebaseline, you're rebaselining your timeline, your cost, your budgets, all of that. So rebaseline accordingly. So when we talk about tips, there are 7 tips for scope management in preventing scope creep. And so again, these are 7 that we found very helpful. Defining the scope up front, agreeing and baselining the scope, and then logging changes, document, evaluate, approve, rebaselining the schedule, project plan, and communicating it. And this number 4, requesting additional funding and resources. So if you add scope, it could be that you need some maybe specific resources. It could be people resources. You might need additional equipment. You might need additional buildings. You might need, it depends on what is associated with that scope, but generally you're having to add things that need to be funding. So you need to identify it, you need to scope out the funding, you need to get it estimated and get that budget approved. And for most companies, that process is not such a quick thing. So you have to allow time, and that also needs to be defined in your change control process, is like what is the process for the funding. Because you don't want to be scrambling trying to figure it out along the way or real time. You want to know up front when that happens, what is the flow, who do you go to, who do you submit the funding to, who's going to evaluate it, who's going to approve it and release it. Then watching for the signs on your project where scope creep could be occurring, where if things are too quiet or things are always okay, those to me are signs that things aren't going well. And so for the case where the person asks a question, you've got the team member that's doing additional work and you don't know until until it's too late. So it could be that they're too quiet, maybe they don't want to tell you. So it's doing a checkpoint on all your team members and just seeing if they always say that things are okay. Well, typically things are not just always okay. You know, with projects, things are changing. Like the New York Stock Exchange, it's always changing and moving. So, you know, you as a project manager are trying to accommodate for all the things. So if everyone is telling you it's okay, then people are either lulled asleep, they're not paying attention, or they're too afraid to let you know what's happening. So that's where you do your due diligence. Set priorities, so that's working with the change control board. Remember, that's your working with the change request, your change request process, your change control process, working with them to help identify, work with your team on estimating, bring back to them information like, okay, if we do this, if we add this scope, or if we change it or delete it, these are the impacts. It's going to cost this much, we're going to need this many resources, it's going to take this long. Then we avoid traps, such as the catchphrases. These typically the person who asks the questions on my customers are world's worst enemy about adding scope creep. These are some of the catchphrases that you'll usually hear. Is while you're in there, so that's my favorite, like while you're in there, so meaning for people doing maybe technology projects, the users think while you maybe opened up code or you're reconfiguring something. Sometimes for people on construction projects, they think while you're adding this, you know, wing on, or you're adding this building, while you're in there, you can just add this. Or while you're doing that, you can fill in the blank. Or all you have to do is blank. I love that one because it's compared to what? You know, it's not like your customers has ever, you know, had to be responsible for actually doing the task or activities to produce these deliverables. So they like to minimize how much effort or how much time or how many resources that it's going to take. So they love to say all you have to do is, and they make it sound so simple, but it's typically not. And the last one is, it will not take that long. So again, based on what knowledge, because typically they haven't done it, they don't have all the facts together. So these are some of the catchphrases to avoid the traps in scope creep. So we've got a little bit of time. I want to see if there is another. Let's see. I've got one that says, okay, so there's a question here that says how to manage the change requests that come across when the project is about to go into production. Shall we accept it? Well, it's my strong philosophy that that's really up to the change control board. So a lot of times the project manager may have, you know, opinion, but we're part of the change control board. It's not the project manager's decisions. It's really the change control board. I've been shocked and amazed constantly on projects and what decisions have been made in working with the change control board. Because remember, these are the board are the people who who have the authority. They've been named by the organization, they've been named by the project, they're in the project plan, they have the authority for their organization, their company, whatever, to evaluate the change request and either approve them or deny them. And again, I can say that I'm shocked and amazed. Sometimes they may have you include it, but you as the project manager have to work with the team to bring back information on a change request and what impacts it may have, because that's where your strong suit is. That's where your influence and impact comes in as a project manager, working with the team to bring back powerful information and let them know, okay, and it's like you don't tell them they can or can't. You say, if we do this change, here are the impacts. You know, we may need 2 more weeks. We may need more time. We may need, for some projects, it could be another year. We may need another year. We may need more money or more resources. I kid you not, and this was even in the year 2001. On my background is I've done a lot of software, enterprise software projects, so a lot of times you'll hear me talk about technology type projects. That's my background. But in 2001, there was a project we were working on. It had been a 3-year initiative. It had already cost $500 million, and here at the last minute to really get this thing completed, it was going to take another 2 to 3 years was the evaluation, when it was evaluated, and was going to cost another $500 million. So the customer actually made the decision to can the entire project because they evaluated for the company. They couldn't spare another 2 to 3 years, and they could not spare another $500 million. So they canceled the project. And again, shocked and amazed. That was a really big decision, but on the grand scheme of things for that company, it was a drop in the bucket. That budget may sound like a lot for me or other people, but for the company, that budget was like minuscule in the grand scheme of things. So we don't know what perspective the customer has, and if you think about some projects, maybe in healthcare, I've seen some projects where maybe there is an inoculation that has to come out. Maybe there's been an epidemic of something, and they have to get a treatment out. And so, yes, decisions have to be made. We've got to do certain things, and we have to get something out there. If you think about some of the natural disasters that happen at least, once a year, throughout the world, there are decisions that are made where things have to be done. Hard decisions are made. A lot of work's done to reroute things, reschedule, reshuffle, reprioritize, so that things can get done. And the Change Control Board consists of members on the team who have a bigger understanding or grander understanding of how these things are important for their company in either responding to critical things they have to respond to, getting something time to market. And it's not just about, when we say time to market, it's not just about getting a new product out there, which for, in the economic times for some businesses to get something out to market, that determined whether that company stayed in business or not. But if you think about time to market being a health, like a inoculation or some kind of thing for health reasons, or responding to natural disaster, it makes sense. So that was a long tear to answer that question, but it really depends, and it depends on what the situation is. So these are just a few items that we have related to scope. Again, in the beginning of the call, scope is an area where we could spend days. So we could spend days on many aspects of this, but what we wanted to bring to you today is a high-level area, some of the things that are important that need to be addressed, whether you're new to project management and you're asking the questions, I'm having some issues with scope, I don't know how to do it. Again, if we start in defining it, the critical thing for you to produce in defining your scope is setting up a deliverables diagram. The picture's worth 1,000 words and saves you 1,000,000 meetings. Having a good way to monitor your project and your scope frequently, and having the mechanisms in the way, and implementing a way to manage the change request and the change control, the change for your project. And then offering some best practices and some of the tips that we found along the way. These are just, again, a few items. This goes on for days. It's not the end-all be-all, but it's some things that we found that's very helpful no matter if you're new to project management or you've been doing it for a very long time. So a lot of people ask, like, what would be a next step? So for everything we do with projectmanager.com, we talk with you, we get your emails, we work with our customers in best ways to manage scope on projects. And the key for the project managers is always organizing your work. Just staying organized, knowing what the scope is, being able to organize yourself so that you can manage and control your own work effectively. But these three things is, again, highlighting to share project plans, and the project plans is where the baseline scope is identified. So as you're evaluating, does this meet the scope? Does it meet the original scope? Is there a change? Does it meet the requirements? So sharing those project plans easily, managing team activities online so that you and your whole team has insight and access to this, and tracking scope real time. It is the split second, and if you think of derailing, if you think of trains and derailing, it's a split second between a successful project and a failed project. So where can I start? I always say that we started by adding these capabilities into the software on projectmanager.com so you can track your project and your scope more effectively. So there are ways that you can customize your own dashboards and have your project planner, so they offer things there. So where can you start? If you need tools and templates, something to help you manage your scope or your project, this is where you can start. Projectmanager.com, we're offering a free trial, so it's a 20-month. We're offering it free to just check it out. So people are asking, like, what are some tools? They want access to online apps, and we've got an app out there, and easy. So just check it out and organize your work. It's a good way to organize your work and give insights into the scope. So I hope this was helpful. We tried to give you some ways to define your scope, monitor it, implement the change control board, offering what we found is our 6 best practices and 7 tips, and one simple step that you can take. So again, we thank you for joining us. We hope you sign up now at projectmanager.com, and more importantly, I hope you check out some of our other resources and join us again soon. Thank you so much.